Hi everyone, welcome to Nonsense Whisky. My name is Vin PF, and on today's episode we're going to be going back over to America and actually to a state that I have already covered, so unfortunately I can't scratch off the map anymore. This is a New York-based distillery, and this is Widow Jane. Some of you may have heard of this, especially if you're into your bourbons or if you're in America, but for me it was a fairly new one. I picked this up at a festival recently, met the head distiller who is a Vince, so good to meet another namesake. The one I tried at the festival was their 10-year bourbon. This is the 8-year bourbon. Now, a couple of things about the distillery that you probably need to know before we get into this is that the stuff you're buying right now, unfortunately the 8-year isn't available for purchase anymore. You could probably get it on auction sites if you really want to, but it's quite expensive. The 10-year is selling for about £70 in the UK. If you're in America, like a lot of you are, you probably get it a bit cheaper than that. So it's definitely a bottle to think about before you buy, and I know on Master of Malt especially you can get samples of it right now. So it's definitely worth trying before you buy. But the key thing about this is that this spirit that we're drinking today hasn't been produced by Widow Jane Distillery in New York. This is sourced from Kentucky. I think they used to source from MGP in Indiana a while ago, but now this is exclusively from Kentucky. Proper Kentucky bourbon. The barrels are bought by these guys and shipped to New York, where they cut it down to their bottling strength, which in this case is 45.5% or 91 proof, as is their 10-year actually, but they cut it down with their own limestone water, which is brought from the Widow Jane cave or mine, and that is a bit further up upstate New York, outside of the main city. So there's lots going on there. They're not, although they're not secretive about it, it's not all on the label. Sometimes on the bigger bottles you'll see here it says bottled by Widow Jane Distillery, Brooklyn, New York. Sometimes it will say distilled in Kentucky if you have a full bottle of it. But they are producing whiskey themselves now. They are producing bourbon now and have been for some time, but they're laying those casks down and waiting until they're ready before they sell them as their own. The actual distillery has been going for 6 years, and they're based in, as I said, in New York, in Brooklyn, in a smaller area called Red Hook, and they're actually based in the same site as a chocolate factory. So when you go for tours, you can go there and you can check out the whiskey and all their other range of stuff, because not only are they making bourbons, they're making rye, they're making proper kind of malt whiskies as well, amongst some other smaller bottlings, limited releases, things like that. But you can also go and check out a chocolate factory on the same site, which I think is pretty awesome. But enough about all the history of it all. Let's check out the actual whiskey itself. I'm assuming it's going to be pretty good because it's Kentucky and aged for 8 years. But let's get into the nose of the thing and see where we're at. It's got a wonderful nose on it. Now, we can assume a few things. Because it's a bourbon, it's going to be at least 51% corn in the mash bill. So we're getting a lot of typical bourbony notes, the kind of creaminess, the vanillas from the new American oak. But for my nose, we're also getting a little bit of kind of minty menthol notes to it. So my limited experience in bourbon would tell me that there's more than a little rye in there. So I think it's probably quite a lot of rye. I couldn't give you the exact percentage. Let's try a little bit. So straight away you're getting a big hit. Big hit of that vanilla-y oak, but also big spices. This is very, for me anyway, very indicative of rye. Previously I haven't been a big fan of rye, and I say a big fan, I enjoy it, but not to the point where I could say I love it. Whereas when they add rye into a normal bourbon, so on top of 51% corn or whatever they choose to do with the corn, above 51%, it's a nice easy gateway for me. Haven't covered many full ryes on the channel, but I will be covering a couple soon. So yeah, I think, yeah, definitely some rye in there, and I think it's pretty good liquid. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out the name of the distillery it comes from. It's a bit of a secret, but they're just getting this out there and cutting it with their own limestone. And that's the really important part of this. And they make a big deal out of the limestone water. It's got a very specific chemical makeup that is supposed to be unique to that mine, and that's what they use to chuck in. Now, we've talked a lot about kind of compositions of whiskey on this channel, but obviously it's only a few ingredients, allegedly. So we're talking about the barley and whatever processes it goes through to get to being a spirit. We're talking about water, so whatever source of the water, you know, these things can be recreated. So we are talking about a chemical composition here, and technically speaking, that could be created in a lab somewhere, but it isn't. It's sourced from a proper mine, and the final ingredient is oak. Of course, you could count yeast in that as well. Depending on where you get the yeast from, you're getting a lot of different flavour profiles from that. Especially if you're looking at like Four Roses, for instance, they have a couple of different yeast strains, and you can really tell the difference in those. So, but a lot of people use specific distillers' yeasts, which I think irons out flavour profiles a bit, but that's just my palate. So water is incredibly important, and the water that's added before distillation tends to disappear off a little bit. You know, what comes off the stills could be sort of 70, 80, 90% depending on the process that goes in place, but this is cut straight into the whiskey that's in the barrels. So we're talking about water that isn't distilled, it's going straight in there, and the influence of that chemical makeup is influencing the whiskey. So I think it's an important thing. I'm looking forward to seeing what they actually produce from their own stills, but I think if it's anything like this, then they're going to be doing well. The only downside, of course, is the price of it. In the UK, the 10-year-old right now, which is available, is about £70. It's pushing it a little bit for me, but I don't mind that too much for bourbons, because especially the limited release stuff like this and the 10-year version of it, it must cost them a fair amount to get it across the sea anyway, plus all the taxes that we impose on it, the import and their export taxes, whatever. It's going to be expensive, and it's the same when we ship out our Scotch to you guys over there across the pond. But overall, I think it's a pretty good whiskey. I'm eternally grateful for the head distiller for giving me this bottle at the festival. I actually really enjoyed their 10-year. It's one of my favourite whiskies I had of the day at the festival, and I think well worth checking out. If you've got the money, go for it.